Welcome to the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast from Bradford Literature Festival. In this episode, leading experts Professor Owen Green, Dr. H.A. Hellier, Salman Sheikh and Professor Paul Rogers explore what the future holds for Syria, from rebuilding institutions and seeking justice to managing sectarian tensions, regional influence and refugee return. Recorded live at the 2025 festival, our panel considers what it will take to move from survival to stability, and if a lasting peace can ever be built on the ruins of the past.
Welcome once again to this next event. Some of you have been in the previous event, and it's lovely to see you back again and familiar faces throughout the day. Welcome to Bradford Literature Festival 2025. We hope you're enjoying our programme. We have another event about Syria, and the last one was very interesting indeed. So please welcome our panel, which is going to be chaired by the wonderful Paul Rogers, and please welcome them to the stage with a very warm hand of applause.
Well, thank you very much. And since this is a panel discussion, we can sit down, which I think people will rather like, and I hope it's okay with you. I'm Paul Rogers. I worked most of my career at Bradford University, and we've got a great panel here. On my far right is Owen Green, also a former colleague of mine at Bradford, worked in international security for a good few years. Is that fair, Owen? Then Hisham Hellier from the Royal United Services Institute, particularly specialist on security studies in relation to the Middle East. And here's Salman Sheikh from the Sheikh Group, another very prominent person working in this field. We're not quite sure exactly how to do it because we do want to see audience participation and plenty of questions and discussion. So what I'm going to ask to do, we've got an hour and a quarter, which is generous. I'm going to ask each of our panel members to initially speak for about 10 minutes, if we can, and then go through the main points they would want to make in 10 minutes or less or very tiny bit more. I'll be coming in pretty quickly if it's much beyond that. And then we'll open it straight up to discussion. When it comes to discussion, it's a pretty wide subject. Please feel free to ask any questions, even if you might feel that some of them are rather basic, because this is not my field of specialism, and I will learn as much as you if you're willing to do that. So we'll get started straight away. Owen, would you like to start first?
I don't mind. Yes, I'm happy to. So it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for coming. So Syria is obviously preoccupied my and a lot of other people's attention very intensely, particularly over the last 15 years with the terrible civil war that some people would argue is still going on, but I think it's over for the time being. But nevertheless, it was a war that destroyed a society that was already highly oppressed and incredibly oppressively and badly governed for 50 years, if not longer. And so I'm going to focus on, just trying to assess where Syria is now, really, and what are the issues. And of course, I say this in all due modesty, it's an extremely complex and dynamic process. So I was just in a meeting last Friday, which was, which taught me new things about exactly how power is being distributed to the regional and local councils in Syria in a way that was significant. So we're learning all the time. Just as a way of starting things off, of course, what I think I'll use is the sort of standard categories that we've all become familiar with, professionals in this area, when we're examining the situation in fragile and conflict-affected states, and just sort of say a few headlines around each of those. So obviously conflict-affected means many things. One of the big issues with countries that are emerging from conflict is, did it end with a victory or did it end with an awkward compromise? And in this case, one of the advantages some people would argue for Syria is it has ended in a sort of victory. There was no doubt who was defeated. The Assad regime has gone. And as it turns out, over the last 10 years, it had hollowed out through its own focus on its own interests, as opposed to even the clientelist groups. Those are the sort of supporter groups that supported it in repayment for favours. Those people looking for favours from the Assad regime gradually got squeezed out. Other resources were much less over the last 10 years. And so when it came, the defeat was very quick and perhaps not surprising looking back, although it came as a shock to a lot of us. Now, in the post-conflict environment, of course, there's tremendous trauma, there's tremendous a need for a reckoning, as it were, amongst many people in relation to the conflict itself. There have been many atrocities during this war, particular intensity of atrocities, all of which there are people looking for their own relatives, trying to find out what's happened to them, and that was the first story for the first 3 or 4 months, but it still is now. But also, all of the shock of trying to hold people accountable in a chaotic context. There's the trauma, there's the individual trauma. There's the trauma of all sorts of rights that were trampled on for 50 years, but particularly over the last 10 years in terms of property, customary property that's been looted by various groups, not only by the Assad regime and trying to restitute that. There's the question of returning. There were 6.5 million roughly internally displaced, 6.5 million roughly refugees from Syria. I worked a lot amongst Syrian refugees in very north of Jordan. And even when things looked a little bit more stable over the last 4 years, there was tremendous reluctance to go home because they were met often with death squads and extortion and so on. But now there's quite a return, which leads to a chaotic situation. So we've got all the customary issues that I can certainly elaborate on, and I'm sure my colleagues can too, about a country emerging from conflict, and it's always hard. Don't forget that one of the great innovations at the end of the Cold War, we may not see it much longer, was that the UN and UN Security Council being able to marshal very large amounts of resources to assist countries emerging from conflict. Syria has not been the beneficiary of that. There hasn't been a UN Security Council mandate to provide a sort of peace support mission of any substance. But don't forget that over the last 30 years, we got used to the idea of those being desperately needed in terms of the resources and in terms of the support. But aware of my time, let me move to another dimension, and that is fragility. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard the term fragile states. I can see some nods and others that are sort of not quite sure. Let me just briefly explain that before I go through. The notion of a fragile state was something that emerged in the policy discourses about 20, 25 years ago, where people were trying to capture the fact that there are a lot of countries that are suffering many problems, poverty, political division, all of those sorts of things, but where the big challenges are primarily political economic. They're not just poverty, they're not shortage of resources. And so people were trying to get to grips with that. In other words, recognizing that if you're seeking to engage with those countries, or if you're a citizen of them, it's not simply a question of capacity building and assistance in that way. There's quite a deep transformation of that society which needs to take place. Initially, there was a sort of concept called conflict prone, but a lot of countries didn't like to be called conflict prone because fragile states includes a lot of countries that haven't endured a civil war, but have a lot of those problems. There was then a World Bank concept, which was terribly diplomatically polite, which was called developing countries under stress, least developed, low-income countries under stress, which was a bureaucratic and technocratic way of being polite, but it meant that you missed the point. That everybody's under stress. These are societies that have very deep challenges of governance and others. And so out of that came the notion of fragility, which I just take a moment to explain so that it's not misunderstood. Fragility doesn't mean failed. There's no statement of something being failed. Sometimes people have popularized that notion, not using that here, but it means deep challenges. And while we have an experience, I can remember I was in fact on the panel within one of the UN agencies back in 2002-03, where they were refining this, and we were asked by the political authorities, okay, how many countries probably in the world are fragile? And we said, well, it depends on your criteria, but probably somewhere between 60 and 90. And they said, well, that's a completely politically unusable concept. Can't be more than 30. Otherwise, we'd be admitting too much. So you can see it's sort of the grey area contestation. But in that context, there are 5 or 6 headings that people often talk about when you're talking about a fragile country. And let me just briefly make a few comments on Syria in relation to those headings. Governance. Well, obviously we have a new government, HTS, which successfully declared a transition government a few months ago, slightly more inclusive than it might have been, and an interim constitution for the next 4.5 years now, I guess. And but this is a country with a profound governance crisis, because what you have is a 50-year regime which has just been swept away, so there are none of the residues there, but so many other areas have been marginalized, undermined, brutally suppressed, and so on. And so things are having to be constructed, in principle, you might say technocratically, from basics, from the beginning. But the thing about societies is that you're never dealing with a blank page. You're never starting from the beginning. You're starting from what exists. And what exists is a really complex mosaic of micro-governance structures. We obviously have the Kurdish forces off in the northeast. You have Turkish-supported forces. You have so many different, you have the different identity groups, the Druze, so many others that have their own patterns of governance that affect their own society. But they've been working under either conditions of suppression or conditions of accommodation with the Assad regime over the last many years. And so there's a lot of challenges there, not only at the national level, but at the regional level and at the local level. I understand, and this is what I was referring to at the beginning, that they're now in the process, that's the HTS-led government, of sort of establishing, recognised by at the national level, local and regional councils to govern the place. But those are very cautiously constructed. On the one hand, the HTS government is very concerned that it maintains the key levers of power. On the other hand, there are sort of efforts for inclusiveness. And there's very little trust going around. So governance, I could elaborate on that. Another issue that people often worry about to do with fragile states is security. And here we're talking above all about human security from violence and coercion. So many of you will be aware that there are many welcome statements from the HTS government as it was established to try and rule in a non-partisan way, but there have been attacks, relatively organised attacks from Alawite post-Assad elements for a period, but between the Druze and the HTS government supporters, not clear at what level of authority that took place. And so there are many, many different challenges, which are essentially the problems of warlordism, come gang violence, come being able to operate with impunity. One of the problems with any post-conflict environment or a highly fragile state is that groups that have power or access to arms have learned that they can act with relative impunity. And one of the big transitions is to try and develop a framework in which people are held to account. But that takes a long time to work, and I think it would be said that most Syrians that I've met over the last 2 or 3 months in this context feel much, much more secure than they did a few years ago, except, of course, those that are tarred with the brush of the Assad regime, which includes large sections of the Alawite community, which many of which didn't benefit from the regime at all. They were relatively poor, but many of them did, and so there are insecurities there. So there are terrible troubles about establishing security. Now, here, you're dealing with lots of different contexts, very different contexts, and so you build security up by pieces. One of the biggest successes so far has been the agreement between the Kurdish forces and the HTS, the national forces, to merge to form a single national army and to essentially accept that Syria is a national state and its institutions will be national. But those negotiations are going to be tough and ongoing and very uncertain outcomes, particularly since there are powerful outside actors that are not necessarily going to be comfortable with some of the potential outcomes. And I'll come back to the outside actors in a second. Another issue that's classic for a fragile state is this sense of lack of access to justice. I don't mean that the society is unjust. That's a big concept, and most societies are unjust. I mean that there's people have no confidence in the functioning of relatively due process dispute settlement systems. So all depends on who you know, who you can corrupt, or who you can coerce. And that is a challenge in Idlib, where HTS had its history. It acquired a reputation for at least providing basic justice that people could rely on to some extent. But that's a challenge to now translate it to different parts of the country. There are certain calls, because, of course, the Assad regime security and police forces are discredited, and judicial forces, and so they've been swept mainly from office. But what that means is that there are a lot of lack of experience and professionalism amongst the groups that are coming forward, so there are calls. Okay, just a couple of final words then. Societal divisions. Societal divisions, I hardly need to tell this audience, particularly afterwards, there's a lot of different identity groups, and it's very complex. It's not simply faith identities. I was very struck with working with diaspora, in other words, not in refugee camps, but Syrians that were relocating to the borderlands of northern Lebanon and Jordan, just by what every Syrian knows, and that's that even those that are classically sort of Arabic, Muslim Syrian, have very, very different social mores, social understandings, and so on, and there's a lot of different challenges there. Final point, since I'm running out of time, is This is recovery. I mean, I'm an optimist. I'm one of those people that even if the glass is only a quarter full, I'm a glass quarter full person rather than 3/4 empty. So I am an optimist, but it's going to be really tough. Don't forget that one of the strengths of this regime is it knows ISIS and al-Qaeda well because it has history in those links. On the other hand, those are very powerful forces that are still well embedded, but where people aren't quite sure how well in parts of Syria. There are countries, neighboring countries, that do not wish the current regime well. That's not necessarily that they're adversaries, but they would be much more comfortable with a fragile and weak Syria than with a confident, strengthening Syria. And so those are Turkey, Israel, Iran, to name three, all with slightly different takes to that. There are also countries in the neighborhood that definitely wish Syria well. Jordan, desperately, because so much of Jordan's prosperity depends upon a stable and functioning. Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar in their different ways both have come in with quite large aid. But it's a rough neighborhood. And right now, I think there's a window of opportunity for the HTS government and the emerging national government, because a lot of the countries that historically would have been opposed to them are relatively weakened. Obviously, Iran at the moment, Russia decided not to intervene. Don't forget, the Assad regime would have lost 15 or 16 years ago if it hadn't been for the decisive intervention of the Russians and the Iranians. And on this occasion, as the regime toppled, both of those didn't feel it was a priority to support the regime. But nonetheless, they are not necessarily confident. So we're dealing with a country that has external groups that do not wish them well. Obviously, from the point of view of the West, whatever that means, the European Union, UK and US, there's been a nervous but collective decision to try and support and make the best of this present government, and that's welcome. What we now need to see is perhaps greater and more sophisticated action to actually provide support. So with that, thank you.
Thanks so much, Owen. Thanks so much for getting us started. A good roundup of right the way through. Hisham, would you be willing to go second? Is that okay with you?
Sure. Thank you.
Thanks.
So first, it's very nice to be here, back in Bradford again. This is my second event of the day. I remember being in this building a few years ago on a book that I'd written on something far more, how should we say, esoteric as compared to what we're discussing today. What we're discussing today is very real. And what I mean by that is I was in Damascus in 2010. Damascus was and remains a beautiful city, but it was a capital that I thought I would never be able to return to as a result of 2011 and my stances thereafter. The second capital, which is not a capital at present, was Jerusalem. And I did not think that I'd be able to go back to Jerusalem again, and I'm not sure that I was wrong about that. It is not the capital of Israel, it's the capital of a future Palestinian state, but it was one place I really wanted to go back to, and I'm not sure if I'll be able to. But, 1 out of 2, inshallah, won't be so difficult. And I think some of you were here when Saeed was talking about the history of Syria, and he mentioned the Arab Spring. I lived through that Arab Spring. I moved to Cairo at the end of 2010 because things in Oxford were too hectic, and I thought Cairo would be easy and simple. It was December 1st, 2010. And I lived through the following sort of 5-6 years there. And I saw Syria from that vantage point within the region and against the backdrop of the Arab Spring. And I know it's very popular now to talk about the Arab Spring as though it was some sort of conspiracy delivered from afar. I think people should really be careful about being so blasé about the agency of millions of people. And I mean this in particular when it comes to Syria. Syria was not the result of machinations from outside as much as it was the result of people inside wanting a better future for their children and for their communities. It's not to say that people outside didn't get involved. Of course they did. And even in the UK, during the Brexit referendum, we had forces outside who were very interested in getting involved. So it's not that that doesn't take place, but it's very important, I think, to prioritize Syrian agency. And I apologize to any Syrians in the room. I'm not Syrian, and there should be a Syrian on this panel, but I don't think that was possible for the panel. There should also be a woman on the panel, and I'm afraid I don't think that was possible, and I know that they tried. But speaking at least with that vantage point in mind, where you did have, and you continue to have, including, and I would term it a victory, on December 8th of Syrians pushing back the Assad regime Of course, they did not do it in some sort of vacuum where nobody else was involved. Of course, others were involved because Syria is a very strategic country in the region. It's an important country in the region. So, of course, people are going to get involved. But it wasn't puppeteering either. And I think that that's important. I'm not going to take my full 10 minutes. I want to throw out some things first and then move on so we can get the questions. But challenges, and I think you elucidated some of the challenges. I want to mention a few others that are internal and external, and perhaps with a slight difference of opinion when it comes to external challenges, because I think that some actually do wish it really unwell, the new authorities in Damascus, and Israel is definitely at the top of that list. But looking domestically, the situation of the Kurds, I think, is a very, very difficult nut to crack. I think that the government in Damascus has been trying. I think that they could do more, but I don't think that this is something that's impossible to overcome, primarily, frankly, because the Assad regime is gone. And because the Assad regime is gone and the balance of power in the region has shifted quite a bit, this is the reason why I think the PKK decided we're done. Okay, the violent struggle is over. We need to come to terms. We need to move forward in a different way. I think that was a very positive step. And I think it will take some time. A deal was struck some months ago. It has not been put into effect. But I think that that represents at least a willingness to move forward when it comes to the Kurdish question in the Northeast. When it comes to pluralism and governance, there was a horrible suicide attack earlier this week in a Damascus church claimed by an ISIS sort of affiliate. The government reacted very strongly, very, very prominently, and I applaud them for that. At the same time, the bishop at the church publicly told Ahmed al-Sharaa, you called us, you gave us your condolences, it's not enough. And he said it very, very, very publicly. So I think that that's positive in several ways and negative in several ways. It's positive because he felt he could do that. He felt that he could stand in Damascus and publicly tell the president of the Syrian Arab Republic, it was not enough what you did, Mr. President. Do better. Okay? And, I wouldn't take that for granted. I remember very clearly when the new government was announced, when al-Sharaa created his new cabinet, there was an old man from Sweden, which is a predominantly Druze area. He stood up and he started not heckling, but he started really going at the president. And I thought, had he even dared to stand up, let alone shout and, criticize him during the Assad regime, we would never hear from that man ever again. And probably most of his family too. Okay, but he felt that he could do that, and he could do that. I don't think that's something to be taken for granted. I think that's very important. Having another positive part of it is that Sharaa did call, and that Sharaa did send people to try to put them at ease. But negatively, and I think this is totally justified, they didn't feel that Sharaa had done enough. And they didn't feel that the government had done enough. And a common critique of the new authorities in Damascus, I'm hesitant to call it HTS because they've disbanded. But I know what you mean, and I wish we could find a better way of describing this, but the new authorities...
Yeah.
I beg your pardon?
Coalition government, yeah, okay.
I suppose, but then they don't even have a party yet, right? But anyway, so the new authorities in Damascus are very concerned about holding on to the levers of security really with a tight fist, because they feel that until they get that all under control, they can't really move into other areas. Now, on one hand, they're right. On the other hand, it means that could be a self-fulfilling prophecy forever, right? And it's important that you still see people like the bishop or civil society in Syria constantly raising this concern, because I think that it's only going to be in that sort of give and take kind of engagement that things are going to get better with regards to Syria more widely. On the external situation, and here I think is important, not just for people in the UK, but elsewhere, there are a number of external threats. Iran was a big external threat to the continuation of the new political dispensation in Damascus. I don't think people realize how much the Iranians were furious. So the Iranians were one, and they continue to be a very difficult actor in this regard, more so than even the Russians. The Russians came to terms pretty quickly, deciding that, okay, we lost. But actually, Naz Shah, your MP, everybody, Naz Shah, Salman Sheikh, and myself were all in Doha last year. And in the morning, we saw Lavrov talk about Jabhat al-Nusra, the horrible terrorist group, in the morning. And by the evening, they were talking about how they didn't have any problems in engaging new relations with the new regime in Damascus. So the Russians came to terms pretty quickly. And they showed a willingness in that regard, and Ahmed al-Sharaa and his government also showed a willingness in that regard. And Damascus has gone, I think, all around the region. Of course, they didn't need to go to Istanbul or to Ankara because they have very long-standing relations in that regard, even though, by the way, Jabhat al-Nusra was not the Turkish candidate for taking over. We can get into that if you want to, but they came to terms with it very, very easily, very quickly. They already had established relationships. The Jordanians were very nervous. The Jordanians were very nervous because they weren't sure which way Damascus would actually go in terms of the extremism file. But they came to terms with it and said, okay, well, this is better than what we have instead, whatever else we could have instead. But they weren't big fans of the whole thing. I think that they were very, very nervous. The Emiratis started off incredibly nervous, and they gradually allowed themselves to believe that maybe this isn't going to be quite so bad. And besides, what else are we going to do anyway? The Qataris, of course, were very happy. The Saudis went full in, and I think that that was very positive for Syria. The Egyptians remain skeptical for reasons that we can go into, but it's just to say that that's the case. The Israelis are on record. An Israeli minister literally said, "This does not end." This does not end is I'm paraphrasing, but he said until Syria is dismembered.
Yeah.
Okay, that it's split into different parts. Okay, and that ties into a wider conversation around how militarism in this region, primarily at the hands of the Israelis, and an environment of utter and complete impunity, has really set stability back in the region for many, many years. And it's not getting any better anytime soon. So I think that the Israelis have actively tried to destabilize Syria with their strikes, with their further occupations within the Golan. The Golan Heights, of course, occupied since 1967. They went further than that. They occupied more Syrian territory, and they've been bombing, not daily since then, but they certainly took out a great amount of any military hardware that the government had access to. But also they keep on going further into Syrian territory, and they actually kidnap people from there. Okay, so it's really quite a destabilizing set of moves from Tel Aviv. When you think about closer to home, the European Union was being extremely, I have to say, I found it really disgraceful, but they were being very slow and also being very conditional. Of course, there were scores of sanctions that had been placed upon the Assad regime in order to force a change in behavior. The Assad regime is gone. The moment that he was gone, the discussion should have been about how to remove those sanctions. Instead, the Europeans kept on talking about how to suspend those sanctions. You don't suspend sanctions on a regime that no longer exists. You want to put new sanctions, go ahead and do that. But there was no Assad regime. It was gone. And it was really quite extraordinary to see this hand-wringing within the European Union about removing sanctions on a regime that no longer existed, and compare that to how little they were willing to do when it came to a regime that has a government that is at the ICC and the ICJ for genocide. Okay? It was extremely disheartening to see that. They all got on the back foot because Donald Trump decided to lift sanctions and lift them, get rid of them completely. And surprisingly, he seems to have followed through on a lot of that. The sanctions regime, by the way, is not one regime. There are multiple layers when it comes to the sanctions, and it's actually very difficult to get rid of them very quickly. But to his credit, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but Donald Trump actually did some good and tried really hard to push that through. And I suspect that he will continue to do so, primarily because of relationships that he has in Ankara and in Riyadh. So as far as the future goes, I remember only days before December 8th, the idea that anything positive could come out of Syria was a really faraway fantasy. And come December 8th, something very different took place. And the reason for that is that people saw the potential for an opportunity. And maybe to all of us, that sounds very, very conditional and, lots of factors and variables. That's all true, but it's much more than they had. It's much more than they had. It's been a generation of people that have suffered just in the past 15 years, and several generations of people that knew nothing but the Assad regime. And it was an extraordinary regime. I've never been to another country like that in my life, and I've traveled all around the world. It was a very, very oppressive regime. Nobody should have any romances about that. Does that mean that there aren't huge challenges? There are massive challenges. And my own policy recommendations in different capitals in the region, but more widely internationally, has always been this whole thing could go completely pear-shaped. Better that you try from now to try to give it more of a chance than for you to stay out of it and say, it's too difficult. If Syria becomes even more unstable, then I think that would be very problematic, not only for the region, but also for Europe as well. And on the contrary, if it succeeds, then we would have seen something that in my entire career I never thought was possible. A regime led by a group that started with ISIS and ended with becoming a pluralistic government. This is a big deal, not just for Syria, but for more widely in the region as well. And if there are any Syrians in the room, I apologize if I didn't cover everything properly. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's been really very helpful. Salman, would you like to go finally?
Thank you. I first went to Syria in 2000 with my boss, the UN envoy for the Middle East peace process, Terry Road-Larsen, and we met with this young man, Bashar al-Assad. He had recently become the president of Syria, and there was this hope that he would lead a reform of a regime which had actually been characterized by brutality under his father, Hafiz al-Assad. In terms of my own background, for the last 15 years or so, when I headed the Brookings Institution in Doha, and then under the Sheikh Group, we have seen it our mission to bring Syrians together and get them to work towards their own transition and solution. That's meant hundreds, thousands of Syrians discussing things like constitutional reform, how to conduct their own dialogues, transitional justice, you go on. I was very happy to go back to Syria in the start of January, and I've been back a number of times. I'm going again in the next week or so. So what I'm going to tell you, and a lot of it has been covered, to be honest with you, all the different factors, but maybe what can be helpful is to sort of lift the bonnet a little bit on this sort of real practical, formal and informal diplomatic work that is required, particularly with what I would call them the transitional authorities in Syria today. I would also say that I do see the glass as exactly as half full, not more, not less. This is to use your word, Owen, a fragile transition, and it can go off the rails very quickly. One bullet could do that, especially if it's targeted towards President al-Sharaa. And I believe he's already been subject to at least 2 assassination attempts already. And you'll notice perhaps one of the reasons he didn't go to the church, or he's not going out more, may well be to do with his security as well. Let me give you just a few headlines. And by the way, in the time that we have been working on this, in the informal diplomacy we do, I've been everywhere. Jerusalem, Moscow, Washington, numerous times, as well as, of course, regional and European capitals. And what we didn't do in order to be able to bring those Syrian voices to bear, I think is actually one of the great failures of the international community. And a lot of what has happened to the international system was laid there in terms of the impunity with which the Assad regime was able to operate. And never forget, there are at least 150 to 200,000 Syrians. We just don't know where they are. They're probably dead. We just don't know where they are at this point in time. So anyway, where are we today? Well, and I would also say that today, the Sheikh Group very quickly after a month established a Syria country team. We have 6 Syrians, all Syrians, working inside Syria. They never left, whether it's on the coast, whether it's in the south, whether it's in the northeast, or in Damascus or Aleppo and Idlib as well. So, and we are still advising governments at this moment, which is why, again, if through questioning, perhaps we can go a bit further, but please pardon if I don't go as far as you would like, but please do ask me as well as, of course, these esteemed colleagues. First of all, Syrians, in my view, from what we've heard, want to rebuild their country. That's their number one mission. And they're trying to maintain as disentangled from all the other regional issues which are out there. When it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, it's not as if Syrians don't feel deeply the suffering of Palestinians, but they do not want, again, to be embroiled in that themselves. And to basically remain from as many axes as possible. And therefore, the intervention of Israel, or even friendly countries, is to be managed in this environment. For Israel, of course, they should leave. Now, there is talk about that the Sharaa government will move towards some sort of a peace agreement with the Israelis. I just don't see that.
Oh.
Some are even talking about that as part of a new Middle East by the end of the year. Well, the only way that will happen if there is massive pressure on al-Sharaa, and that won't be long-lasting. That will actually imperil the transition if that pressure is brought to bear, particularly by the United States at this point in time. So that's the first point I would make. And again, the role of international actors, friendly and otherwise, has already been spoken about. Secondly, for the transition to be successful, and remember, it doesn't take 1 year, 5 years. It doesn't even take 10 years. It takes 20, 30 years for us to be able to really judge whether societies in conditions of conflict and war make a successful-ish transition to peace and stability. So there's a long way to go. But for it to be on the right footing, it does have to be as inclusive as possible. It has to be one that brings and makes feel all components of Syrian society, be part of that project of building the new Syria, which many, many have already been part of. You know, I know we've had people in our dialogues who were maybe 18, 17, 20, who are now in their mid-30s, who have worked so hard and being involved in so many discussions about how they will change their country. And whether it's them or it's more experienced technocrats, they have to be part of it. And to the credit, the transitional authorities are starting to do that. Good ministers, many of whom were in our dialogues, as well as at the technocratic levels in those ministries as well. But there is a but. How much will they really be able to have the deciding decision-making power? Some, and if you talk to diplomats, privately they will say to you there's probably only 5 or 6 people on a WhatsApp group who are really making the decisions inside Syria right now. In addition to that, you have the ministers, but then you have a group of other people who are following. So these are, I'm not going to overly criticize, because as has been said, it's a very unique situation. Security is a very big problem, and maintaining control from a group that initially established its governance model in Idlib is something which is a cultural change that they will have to go through. But they will have to do that. And of course, the issues are around, as you said, Owen, and you, Hisham, around governance, transitional justice, especially when you've had so many people who have suffered, civic peace, and I'll come back to that in a minute, as well as the formal constitutional process as well. The current, and there are sectarian tensions, let's not ride roughshod over that. The current sectarian tensions, if they're not managed well, can derail this transition. And again, this is what I believe ISIS and other actors will try to do, even former regime remnants. And by the way, there are probably 250,000, and I'm sorry to use this in sectarian terms, but largely Alawite soldiers who have been sent to their coastal areas, who are no longer being paid today. They're not part of the National Army or the project. And so what they do, and the officers around them, those who haven't fled to Lebanon or elsewhere, will also be very, very important. And to illustrate that, we have had problems. In March, we had at least 1,500 people killed in a round of bloodletting that was focused on the coastal areas. The overwhelming majority of them Alawis. There have been reprisals as well, but you may not hear this in the news, but at least 14 probably Alawis were killed in the coastal areas last week. 2 yesterday, working in their fields, under the age of 20. So there are issues in terms of providing security. Now the central authorities are trying to address that. There is an investigation committee on that massacre in March, as well as a peace committee which is doing its work. But people like us are trying to advise how that can be more effective, and it can be more effective. Secondly, the Druze. The Druze have had a traditional relationship on the other side of the Israeli border as well, but they do want to stay, and they are part of Syria. They are Syrians first, as are Alawis, I would say to you. So even as I try to break this up, there is a sense of Syrianness, which is very much, I think, part and parcel of the fabric of Syria. But having said that, the Druze also have to find with the central authorities exactly the security arrangements that need to take place. And right now what's happened is that there are about 2,100 local Druze personnel who've been drafted to be the police, but there's still no agreement in terms of who's providing the army side as well. The Northeast, you've mentioned it. This is singularly probably the most important issue in terms of how does the Northeast, with its resources and its mixed groupings, which are not just Kurds, but they're also actually predominantly Sunnis, how do they integrate into the overall Syria as such? And here is the discussions between the Syrian Democratic Forces and the interim authorities. Now, as Hisham said, a committee has been formed. There was a visit about 2-3 weeks ago after an initial agreement and handshake between Mazloum Abdi, the leader of the SDF, and Mr. al-Sharaa. And after this committee started to work, there are little steps being taken. So in the area of education, for example, that was the first agreement. There are exams going on right now. 28,000 students are taking their exams in the Northeast with the Damascus curriculum. And that's very important in order to be able to build confidence, which was not possible before as such. So there's the issue of IDPs. In this area, contested area of Afrin, there are probably about 100,000 IDPs who would wish to return to that area. Probably about 12,000 have returned. Then there's the issue of ISIS and the Al-Hul camp and the Ruh camp, which again have about 30,000 family members. But in addition to that, you have about 12,000 ISIS fighters, 2,000 of whom are foreigners, who are in those prisons in the Northeast. So again, it's vitally important that these kinds of accommodations are made. Let me move on to the third area, if I may, which is the economy. The lifting of sanctions by the US president and the suspension of them by the European Union are welcome things. But as someone who now goes to Syria, this country has a long way to go and it needs a lot of investment. And it's not just Damascus, it's throughout the country. Of course, some investment is coming in, some of it from the Gulf, but I believe that there needs to be a broader plan, which doesn't yet exist, but which is being formulated, both by the authorities and by others. This is where I believe the international community can and should be doing much, much more going forward. But I would also say to you, and of course the kind of problems they face is not just the investment, it's even cash. If you go to Damascus, you'll see long queues of people outside ATMs because they can only get small amounts of Syrian pounds out. So how can a business function in that? We ourselves have created a contact group with some of the most prominent Syrian business people, and they'll tell you the kind of problems they're facing. I'm happy to talk about that more as well. But fundamentally, we have to be positive because, as you probably some of you heard in that previous session, Syria is a center of the Middle East where trade, mobility, movement of people and goods is natural to it. And Syria in a connected region can play a very vital role. In fact, that's why we ourselves are working on projects that link the Eastern Mediterranean to the Gulf with a focus on stabilizing Syria and Lebanon and even Iraq as part of the kind of trade routes and data streams and energy routes which are out there. But it cannot be zero-sum. There is a geopolitical competition, Belt and Road, IMEC, I2, U2. There's all sorts of, if they are zero-sum, then they will actually not benefit the people of the region. And it's my final comment is with regards to Israel. The Israelis think that they can make a new Middle East which is comprised of weak, divided, vassal states. And that is why I believe in Syria they've taken advantage of the situation to come in and put that presence. And that's what they see in Lebanon and where they're quite happy to. But of course it comes back onto them. It's not a sustainable strategy unless they want a scenario of constant war, which may well suit Bibi Netanyahu. It may suit, and let me use this word, I'm sorry, some of the fascists in his government who pursue the idea of a greater Israel, but it doesn't serve the Israeli people, and it certainly doesn't serve the people in the region as such. So let us all work and try to imagine that vision of a Middle East which was actually the natural source in the Middle East, of one, again, of example, of language, of culture, of poetry, as well as trade. Exactly what has happened in the last 100 years or so actually has been an aberration. And once Syria gets back to where it rightfully should be, we'll start to see that again, I hope, inshallah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all our panel. It's been a very rich set of analyses, which I hope people have found really useful. In peace studies, we've probably had something like 2,000 people graduate from our courses. Many of them have gone into what you might loosely call post-conflict peace building. And I think it's true, I don't know whether you would share this, Owen, that typically really deep conflicts, you can very rarely expect a sustainable, lasting peace inside 50 years. So in Northern Ireland, they may be halfway there, even though things are so much better. And I think it's very easy for us just to say, well, can we do this, this, and this, and really get things going? It's going to take a lot of time, particularly with Syria, but that doesn't mean there aren't some good signs. And I think some of those have come out in what you said. Got to throw it open to any questions initially, and you keep them fairly. Could I just get a show of hands of people who at this stage would have a question to ask? We've certainly got some starting. That's great. Could I take the one in the middle there and then the one in the front, if I may?
Two short questions on oil. One is, what does the WhatsApp group of decision makers, do you imagine, think about its control or its use of oil resources? And the second is, when we all manage to reduce oil, our reliance on oil, and move away from oil and burning fossil fuels, what will be the economy of Syria's sort of strengths?
Right. Hold on to that. We'll take another question. So we've got two questions together and come with the first one. There's one, I think, in the middle here, was there? Please.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know whether, the opinions of you three on the panel, what sustainable security sector reform looks like in the Syrian context. As in, does it involve fully formed units of the SDF being members of the Syrian MOD, or is it lower level integration in terms of the platoon, section level, etc., etc.?
Could you perhaps anybody like to respond to those fairly quickly? Particularly, I think, the first question, because it brings in the thing we haven't covered to any extent, the probability that Syria will be on the front line with climate disruption. And that's an added problem. Very difficult to even think about given the state of Syria, but you do have to some extent. So
I can go after.
Okay, fine. Owen first.
I'd be happy, but obviously, yeah, the oil question is obviously very important because it's important for Syria, but it's something about the mythology of rich mineral wealth that you need to have. You need to give it particular attention because so much malignly can concentrate around the management of that unless you're careful. So my understanding is that the deal is not really yet done, but the principle is that there'll be a sort of at least a 50-50 sharing between the region and the national government over the next year or two as part of the transition, which will mean a dramatic change. Obviously, SDF and Kurdish, and then, as you say, the Sunni Arab clans there, will probably want to be sure that they can also take some of that. I mean, I think the big challenge here is obviously how the elites, and here we're talking about what technically people talk about the elite bargains in peace agreements. So elite bargains are those amongst the powerful that sort of keep things going and allow powerful networks to at least conditionally begin to cooperate. And so you've got the 6 on the WhatsApp group, famously plus others, but the SDF is very important within that. And so I'm hopeful that as part of the but I haven't read anything about this yet, that as part of the transition, there will be new institutions ensuring transparency in the management of those oil resources so that they're properly used. This is an area of my research specialism, and it is possible to avoid what's called the resource curse, but only if you take positive action to avoid it. It's not something that happens just out of ordinary goodwill. And so, but I'm sure that's high on the agenda of the groups, but it's quite a deep thing to do because obviously in terms of power politics, there's a challenge, people want to control resources, but there's some sort of deal there which at least works better than it being in the sole charge of one group. On the transition, there's a very big set of concerns. This is the transition away from fossil fuels as part of climate change. So obviously how fast that transition is very unclear, but we have the climate change agreement which says it should be pretty far on in the next 10 years. Then clearly there is a big literature about the fragilities, the vulnerabilities that that's going to lead to in all countries that have a heavy dependence on oil and gas. I think the transition is gradual enough, and there's been so much kleptocratic stealing of those resources by the Assad regime for so long that there are ways of managing that positively for Syria. But in terms of Syria, it has many other potential resources. There's rich agricultural land in certain areas. Of course, those are predominantly in the northeast too, but there are others. And secondly, the trading nation, as was just talked about, this is an area where if that gets going. So I think there's a future for Syria. It won't, provided things go well. But those other areas of investment are ones that do require a secure governance structure in order to prosper. In other words, otherwise you just get criminalized trade, which of course has been rife in Syria for the last few years, primarily to the benefit of the Assad family. On the security sector reform, you speak on something that I'm a specialist. I mean, I've worked so much on security sector reform with the UN, with the EU, with many governments and so on across the world. And I think the first principle, no templates. You work from what exists and find a sensible way through. So with that, I wouldn't like to predict, but I would have thought from reading between the lines of what's been agreed that this is going to be an integration across through the transition. The aspiration is that the SDF will be fully integrated at all levels into the national forces. However, how quickly that will happen will depend upon confidence, and therefore it will be a long transition. So right now, it's about finding ways in which the senior command is shared in various ways and what have you. The security sector reform, which is basically just how to change the nature of those providing security, justice, policing, all of those, so that it is actually serving the state and the people rather than an elite clique. And there's so much to be done there. And one of the challenges is, of course, the first step. It's a very difficult step, has been, those police and army that were part of the Assad regime that probably perpetrated abuses, they're out, as has been said. But we learn from Iraq and other places, keeping them out is a really tricky process. And so it probably doesn't affect the army so much, although maybe it does, but the vetting process is extremely important. You need to have a route so that people that have a competence or an aspiration to be part of the police or army or judiciary or whatever it is, have an access. In other words, their history and their identity don't block them, but that there are some reassurances that they're not war criminals and that they're the appropriate sort of person. And that's a very tricky one. I've lived through processes as an observer, not where, everything was agreed in principle, but then the vetting process itself became rapidly weaponized. And so different groups were really fighting that, who was eligible in order to keep their guys in and other guys out. And so a lot will depend on the spirit with which this is handled by the transitional government. So far, the signs are good, but it's so early in that transition with the SDF. Don't forget, there's also other forces. So the Druze and others were mentioned. Here, it's not a question of quite integrating them into the system per se, into the army, but it's a question, one of the key mistakes that can often be made in fragile and other countries is to assume the end state is some sort of ideal centralized police force or something like that. It's perfectly okay to have properly accountable local and regional sort of groups that have authority to do with police and dispute settlement and what have you, as long as it's worked through so there's appropriate accountability. And I imagine that on the policing side and on the security side, in local security side, we're going to find a really complex mosaic, which is going to be quite hard to hold people accountable, but that's the only way forward. And then it will have to see how it goes.
Salman, would you like to come in?
Yeah, just very briefly, I'll try to be as brief as Look, oil is a transitional fuel for Syria. They need it. You only have about 2 hours of electricity even in Damascus. It used to be 6, 7 under the regime. It's going up again maybe to 3, 4. There are some who are now, like the Qataris and others, who are trying to bring in more energy. So it's required because no industry, you're not able to function as such. And also, and in the sea, there's likely to be oil as well if there was the conditions to first demarcate those areas, which is a complicated business, which I won't get into, but it has been done vis-a-vis Lebanon and Israel. So longer term, there is a place for, I think, much more renewable fuels like solar and other. One important thing in the vision I was talking about in terms of connectivity, within the next 5 years, you could actually have Syria and Lebanon connected to the European grid. Europe actually at certain times has an excess of energy. And there are ideas out there now in big countries and even the Commission and others like us talking through how you can quickly connect Lebanon and Syria, because they need the energy now through the kind of GS connectors that they've got. So that's on that. Quickly on security sector reform. This is all about how you rebuild the nation state. And at the end of the day, you do need the state to have the monopoly of the use of force and security. But I agree with Owen, it's different in different places, and it's going to be very delicate. With regards to the Kurds, they insist on the SDF that they be one unit. And that is going to be still a big sort of stumbling block in terms of the discussions going forward. But let's see, and similarly, on the Druze side, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that ISIS is growing stronger. And in fact, there are even now disgruntled members that were with al-Sharaa who may well be going into ISIS units. They were estimated somewhere, and Hisham, you would have more, maybe on this, at least 7,000. That may have grown, actually, because there's some dissatisfaction there. At the end of the day, it will be in that nation state how they organize their state. And this whole question of the F word, federalism, becomes a rather thorny issue. But surely you'll need some level of local, regional, and national arrangement, both in terms of administration, but also on the security side.
Fair enough. Hisham,
just one thing on the security sector. So maybe a month or two after the downfall of the regime, Sharaa did an interview with a Syrian TV personality, and he mentioned the complaints of people in Syria who were annoyed that there hadn't been arrests of people from the former regime, and that a general amnesty had been issued. And I won't take long with this, but when the Blitz began at the end of November in 2024, one of the things that allowed it to succeed without being bloody, was that when the rebels, they were then the rebels, took Aleppo, Halab, they took, it was either a police academy or a military academy, I can't remember which. And when they did, they just told everybody go home. They told all the prisoners, put down your weapons and go home, and you won't be touched. And when you think about, we've talked a little bit about the sectarian issues on the panel, but when you think about a community like the Alawi community, from their perspective, especially against something like Jabhat al-Nusra, they thought it's either fight or die. And when they saw that there was actually a third option, which was, no, we'll just go home and they're going to leave us alone, a lot of them did exactly that. So when that happened, it spread like wildfire. And I think that really impacted things on the ground. And I think that this was the correct decision to make. But it also means that there are loads of people on the ground in Syria who are furious, who are angry to see people walking around, many of whom they know were either corrupt, and that's at the least of it, and going much higher up than that, involved in horrific crimes. And what the authorities have said is, if you think that somebody is guilty of something, then please go through the judicial process and we will address it. But don't go after them yourselves. Don't do a vigilante justice. And I think this is correct. But I'm also not surprised, unfortunately, that there are many who act out of a sense of revenge, of vigilantism, which I think is completely unjustified, but I'm just not surprised about it. And unfortunately, if you don't tackle security sector reform robustly enough, where there's accountability, but also recognition that if you want to go down the route of every single crime being brought in front of, this massive process, then everything falls to pieces. And you've seen that in other contexts when it comes to South Africa, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, where you have to make, I hate to put it like this, but you have to make compromises in order to make sure that the whole thing doesn't completely come to bits. And to their credit, I think the authorities recognize that that's the case, but at the same time, they need to balance that with the genuine desire of just ordinary Syrians wanting some sort of recognition of the pain and suffering that they've gone through for, 5 decades. This isn't about 2011 onwards. That's just 15, that's not even 15 years. This is about decades of 2 Assad regimes, of Hafiz al-Assad and then his son Bashar. And people have long memories. I don't know if anybody even knows Hama. and what happened in Hama in 1982. I'm sure you do. But it was, people still remember those things. And to balance that against, the need to move forward, I think is just something very, very difficult to do. And I hope they do it well.
Can I just give you just 1 second on which I completely agree with what Hisham said. But right now, we don't actually have a transitional justice plan. It's still being worked out.
Yeah.
A security sector plan, or a truth and reconciliation healing process. Yeah. So those things take some time, but they need to come, and they need to come out of the WhatsApp messages of the 5 or 6 folks. Yeah. That's what we're talking about in terms of capacity, and that's what we're talking about in terms of transparency as well. Because otherwise, it enables all those different forces, all of may well have right on their side, to rise up and start to take matters into their own hands.
Absolutely.
As well.
What I was going to say in Syria, as a historian who's studied the period, is you may find Germany after the war a very, very helpful model. What they did was they got those at director level, put them on trial, and they were hung. And they obviously got monsters like the commandant of Auschwitz, and I saw where he was hung during my visit there. But there's a difference between people like that and, let's say, the 18-year-old conscripted guard who's just guarding prisoners. And I think you need to prioritise. You won't get everyone that's involved because it's been so corrupt and big, just like Germany after the Second World War. But you'll need to have a reckon with the obvious directors and the monsters. And I think the only healing will be when Bashar al-Assad is somehow cut back from Russia and given a big sort of Eichmann show trial. I think that could produce a lot of healing. But you need to decide who you're going to target. And if it's just an 18-year-old man or someone who's intimidated in doing orders, you leave well alone. I hope you find that helpful, by the way.
Let me say we've got about 10 minutes left. I'd like to get quick questions and quick answers and try and cover some other areas. We've had a very rich discussion, but let's concentrate on what we can get out of the last 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. A quick one. Salman touched on it. What is the risk of ISIS now if there is that reconfiguration and that grievance?
Status of ISIS. Take the other one as well for the moment, if I may, at the back.
Yeah, it's a question a little bit out of ignorance. I don't know much about the region. I've never visited it, but I first heard of Syria over 50 years ago when I was a member of Amnesty International, and we were pledged and thrown out urgent action to do with people threatened with execution and persecution. Sad to say, 50 years on, that was still happening under the next Assad, whatever. So, are human rights violations going to come to an end there, or is there going to be future needs of urgent actions on threats of execution and imprisonment in that region?
Quick answers. Firstly, on ISIS, what is the current state? Anybody want to comment on that?
Okay, I mean, just very quickly. So ISIS attacks went up, and then they plummeted, particularly over the past couple of months. So the new transitional authorities, I think, take this very seriously. It also means that they have a certain, how should we say, area of maneuver in terms of what they can do themselves. And what I mean by that is all this talk about normalization with the Israelis, I think is really quite funny, because there is no way that Ahmed al-Sharaa is going to take a step like that when he knows that in his own base, he's going to have massive opposition, even if he wanted it. And I don't believe he wants it, but it's irrelevant of what you think he wants and much more relevant about where you think his possibility of action actually is. So the numbers did go up and they plummeted. And they plummeted because when it came to Idlib, Sharaa and HTS managed to take control of security in Idlib and knock out ISIS and Al-Qaeda inside of Idlib and in the area of their control. And they did so very effectively. People can argue about how they did it, but they did it very effectively. And when it comes to the rest of the country, it's obviously much bigger, it's much more difficult, but I saw the numbers. The numbers went up and they have come down, and they've come down because of very concerted efforts by the Sharaa government to do so.
And the question at the back.
Can I just say that when I worked for the UN, Iraq was thrown into turmoil because of an ISIS attack. Well, not just, but the Al-Qaeda attack. I myself lost 5 of my very good friends, and when the UN was bombed, in Iraq. And maybe I'm oversensitive, I do fear that if ISIS gets lucky, a car bomb outside a major hotel or something else, as they've just shown with regards to the church, in trying to stir both sectarian strife, but also trying to get the international community to exit, which is what happened in Iraq and the UN, then that would be a real blow to Syria. So I think we should very much be vigilant.
Quickly, Owen.
Just quickly, yeah, I mean, human rights abuses, will continue, I expect, but the key is to reframe it as something which, I mean, in the framework that you said, that there is now more space and one has to just expand the space for protecting people to exercise their political human rights and so on. But I think one can't be purist about this in terms of criticizing the regime too much if there are continuing human rights abuses. The question is the direction of travel. On ISIS, I think one shouldn't I'm just reinforcing, in fragile states, highly sectarian, war-torn, terrorism, any terrorist group, it's a very fertile area because the whole point is just to perpetrate atrocities in order to divide. And so it will take, obviously, extreme security. This is where, in the east of the country, there's really quite tricky decisions, but there's going to be a long-term continuation of support for the Syrian regime, I guess. But one shouldn't underestimate the extent to which ISIS got embedded in that region. I recently was part of producing a report which went through, just how many properties and land and businesses are essentially owned by ISIS through coercion through the time when they occupied the area. And they have legal title to it. And, that takes a long time to unpick. Yeah. And in the meantime, that's also not just a source of leverage, it's a source of income locally, as well as the very rich sources of income ISIS and IS and Al-Qaeda has from elsewhere in the world.
Can we go to is there one quick question, because we're almost up to time? Anything's been missed? I'm conscious, for example, that we should have had much more time on, will Russia want to make a comeback? What is the role of Turkey? And particularly the really worrying one, the situation in relation to Israel and what Israel plans. It seems to me that's the biggest single problem we have, given that currently and for some distance time, Israel seems to be able to act with impunity. No other quick comments. Any final comment from anybody on the panel? Quickly.
Can I respond
to
that?
Yes, please, Sada.
I don't believe that the Russians will be pragmatic here. Yeah. They're trying to find a deal. There's ongoing discussions going on. And, it's not going to be a quick result because there is a lot that the Russians did with the Assad regime. But at the same time, the transitional government and al-Sharaa are also being pragmatic in those discussions. Israel, I think we've already talked about. And I think it's very important here that President Trump, actually, I don't think we've mentioned him enough, is enlivened to not the ridiculous idea of the Riviera on the beach in Gaza, but the Riviera on the Eastern Mediterranean, where Lebanon and Syria and all of that supported, and he has made some noises to that effect, but where a vision is something that even he can get behind, because I believe it's probably only the US president that can restrain the Israelis. Well, the Turks, the Qataris, the Gulf, I believe they all want to play helpful roles. There are varying degrees to which they're involved. And certainly I believe Turkey and Qatar are more. And finally, we shouldn't forget Iran.
Iran, yes.
We shouldn't forget Iran. Iran, there is an effort to, I think, dismember the regime in Iran. And I think we've only seen one round of what's happening. And now the ability of the Iranians to lash out and try and destabilize Syria again, I believe the Sharaa regime Sharaa administration understands very well as well. And the murky world of mercenaries or ISIS or whoever else can also get support from the Iranians and in terms of their reach. So I think that is something else that we should keep in mind.
I think on that note, we will have to bring it to an end. It's been an incredibly detailed discussion. It makes you realize what is on offer, what has to be done, the challenges, but also the possibilities. And repeatedly, the possibilities came up as well. And I think one needs to hold on to that. But I'd like to thank our colleagues on the panel. It's been really good. Could I also thank the volunteers and the others who've been working behind the scenes on this first very hot day. I think the volunteers there, particularly this is the first day of the festival, as far as I can see, and I've been in 2 or 3 of these sessions today, it's gone almost like clockwork, which takes a lot of doing when everybody's coming together, and we've got heat building as well, so thanks very much. But from our panel, please, a round of applause for a very full answer and very good session. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast with Bradford Literature Festival. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe, share this episode with others and leave a rating. Mark your calendars for the return of Bradford Literature Festival, Friday the 3rd to Sunday the 12th of July 2026.